Hi, this is a wonderful turnout for tonight. I want to welcome you all here. My name is Ron Friedman. I'm the president of the Fort Wayne Jewish Federation. And today it's a real honor to introduce Dr. Ronen Hoffman. Dr. Hoffman is an academician and former member of the Knesset. He served as a member of Israeli Defense and Foreign Affairs Committee in the 19th Knesset. He served as the chairman of the Subcommittee on Foreign Affairs and Public Diplomacy, which oversaw the work of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry for Strategic Affairs, the National Information Directorate within the Prime Minister's office, and departments within the Ministry of Defense. Dr. Hoffman has his PhD in War Studies from King's College, London. He's an expert on the field of political psychology, focusing on psychological and cultural barriers in conflict resolution and political negotiations. He served as personal assistant to the late Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin during his political campaign and was coordinator of the Israeli delegation to the peace negotiations with Syria. Dr. Hoffman also served as a senior advisor to the Minister of Defense, as well as an advisor to the Health Minister on international economic cooperation. He's a lecturer and researcher at the School of Government at the Interdisciplinary Center Herzliya, and is co-founder of the International Policy Institute for Counterterrorism. Tonight's talk is sponsored by the Jewish Federation, as well as the Harry Salin Foundation and the Louis and Ann Schneider Foundation. Let's introduce and welcome Dr. Hoffman. The title of his talk is ISIS, Terrorism, and Future Civilization.
Thank you very much for inviting me, for having me, for coming to listen. I would like to share with you some thoughts and some of my experience about a crazy region which I live in, but beautiful and very interesting and very exciting. And then I would like to open the floor for questions and have a discussion maybe, or at least I would be happy to listen to your questions and speak about whatever you're interested in. I had a cup of coffee here. I don't know if you had a chance to have a cup of coffee, but it reminded me that at some point during my career, I was a member and the coordinator of the Israeli team to the peace talks with Syria. There was a time when we had peace talks with Syria. There was a time when there was Syria. And I was a member of that delegation. And the talks actually took place in Washington, D.C., at the State Department building. There were about 50 or 60 reporters standing outside the building, and we used to come there every morning, went out of our limos, stepped in front of the press. The head of our delegation, Professor Itamar Rabinovich, he was the Israeli ambassador to the US at that time. He said something to the press, some kind of a stakeout, and then we went into the building, and a few minutes later the Syrian delegation would come, and sometimes it was the other way around, and the Syrian head of delegation also would say something to the press. And up at the sixth floor at the State Department building, we sat across the table from the Syrians and we negotiated peace. But on the very first day of the talks, I remember that very well, after 2 or 2.5 hours of very intense arguments, the head of our delegation, Professor Rabinovich, felt that he needs to find an icebreaker, to break the ice somehow. The tension was in the room, and so he opened his briefcase, pulled out a packet of Turkish coffee, looked at the Syrian head of delegation and said, since we are looking for points of agreement, why don't we start by agreeing that American coffee stinks? Let's drink some coffee from the neighborhood, he said. Turkish coffee. And I remember myself, I was very young then. It was the first day of the talks under the new Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin, which I was his personal assistant. And I remember thinking to myself, what a brilliant guy and what a brilliant icebreaker. But then there were 30 seconds of quiet and embarrassment in the room for some reason. And then the Syrian head of delegation looked back on Professor Rabinovich and said, Professor Rabinovich, let me tell you something. When you will return our land back to us, we will maybe consider to drink coffee with you, okay? And then I thought to myself, wow, how are we ever going to speak with these people? How are we ever going to reach peace with these people? And it took me, I think, a few weeks or maybe even a few months to realize, without blaming anybody, really, it took me time to realize that if you want to break the ice or make a gesture to your counterpart in the Middle East, the last thing you want to do is to offer the Syrians to drink coffee with you on the first day of the talks. Because in their mentality, in their culture, the act of drinking coffee together is actually a symbol of friendship. And they are allowed to drink coffee with their counterpart only once the agreement is being achieved. And when you shake hands, not in the first day of negotiations, of the talks, when the official state between the countries is still state of war. And even if they wanted to break the ice, to drink coffee with us, they were not allowed to. So actually the way they perceive that little anecdote is that we forced them to say no, and we did not respect their dignity, and we actually did not understand their mentality. Sorry. So I'm telling you this little true story, little anecdote, because I think it was the first time during my career when I realized how important the cultural and the psychological aspects of the whole thing are. And there are many, many other anecdotes like that to follow, and I can tell you many stories about it. It's not that we just don't understand the mentality of the counterparts. It's of course vice versa. It's mutual. But for many years, I've been watching closely and participating in the conflict management and conflict resolution and negotiations. And I look at the things and I look on the sides to the conflict, and I still think that people are looking for the issues or for decisions to make in wrong, or I shouldn't say wrong, but maybe more irrelevant aspects. Yes, it's very important where the border is going to be at the end of the day. Yes, it's very important how many warning stations are going to be between these two sides. Yes, it's important how many flags will be, above an embassy, and how many people would be able to go through the open borders in times of peace. But that is not the most important, the most relevant part. The most important part is how people feel. What is the deep motivation of people and leaders? And what are the cultural aspects, what are the psychological aspects of the whole thing? So, by participating in that peace process, I actually came to focus with the time on those, what I think are the most relevant things to be able to watch and to observe the situation, especially if it's such a dramatic and difficult situation like we have in the Middle East. So today I would like to speak a little bit about those cultural and psychological aspects. I'd like to speak about terrorism in general, and I'd like to speak a little bit about ISIS in particular. I'd like to speak about the consequences. I'd like to speak about what I think Israel and other pragmatic forces in the region should do in order to face and to cope with that phenomena of terrorism and radical Islamic forces like ISIS and others. But for that, let me take you a little bit to the background of things and how it's clear that the situation in the Middle East is very dramatic, we experience wild changes and very dominant aspect of chaos. Nobody knows what's going to happen tomorrow. Nobody even knows who belongs to whom. You see groups of different guerrillas, terrorists fighting against each other. The intelligence tries to gather information and to come with an assessment. It's very difficult because there's so many changes, the wild dynamic, and people are moving from one group to another group, and it's really very difficult, almost sometimes impossible, to stop for a second or for a moment and really come to the decision makers and say clearly what's going on. So I think what we need to do is to look at the developments that actually brought us to this situation of the current days. What actually happened? How did we get to be in such a dynamic, dramatic situation? I think we have to go back and look, first of all, I think there are maybe three major developments that generated this situation. The first one, in order to understand it, we have to go back to 1979, when Ayatollah Khomeini, the Shiite leader, came to power in Iran. Ayatollah Khomeini was the first Muslim leader who proved not just to the Muslim world, but to the entire world, that you can actually be a dictator and rule a modern country, relatively modern country like Iran, by implementing or by basing everything on the law of Islam, the Sharia. Sometimes we think in our minds that ruling a country according to the most extreme religious elements is being primitive. It's not true. You can be very sophisticated, you can be extremely modern, and still run your country basing everything on the law of Islam. And it was a very, very important lesson in a few minutes when I speak about ISIS. I would say, and I would claim that ISIS is not a primitive organization, very sophisticated people. And they know, and it has proved already 30 years ago that you can actually do it. You can actually get to be a ruler of a very sophisticated, advanced political entity by using the law of Sharia. Well, ISIS are not Shiites, they are Sunnis. But still, it's a very, very important lesson. The second development is quite related, but a little bit different. It starts with the Afghan warriors in Afghanistan and in the war and fight against the former Soviet Union. I don't know if you remember that, but the Soviet Unions were actually involved in the war in Afghanistan, and the Muslim fighters, the Afghan warriors, were able to defeat the Russians and to kick them out of Afghanistan. And in their perception, in their minds, they actually caused the collapse of the Soviet Union as an empire, as a superpower. And when Osama bin Laden moved through Sudan to Afghanistan, he was hosted by those Afghan warriors. And he was planning 9/11 from there, under the impression that if they were able to cause the collapse of the Soviet Union, now what they need to do is to cause the collapse of the other superpower, the United States of America. And that was their intention when they started to plan 9/11. And of course, we know that the U.S. had to reply and to respond to that terrible attack on 9/11. And in many ways, and again we'll speak about it in a few minutes, but in many ways, what's going on today in the Middle East and ISIS and all that is an indirect development of Osama bin Laden, 9/11, and the American response to 9/11 there. The collapse of the Iraqi regime, the collapse of Syria, the collapse of other relatively pragmatic Muslim regimes in the Middle East. It's all about, continuation of the same kind of process. And we have to bear in mind that it's not just, it's not that we woke up one morning and out of the blue we were facing a new or different Middle East. They are all consequences and results of previous developments. And the third major development is, I think, what we used to say the term an Arab Spring. It's not a spring, it's more like a radical winter, very stormy winter. But what is it, the Arab Spring? Arab Spring, people went on the streets and overthrew the regimes in Egypt, in Libya, and other places. For a minute, we were hoping that it's going to lead to a positive dynamic and positive changes, but obviously it didn't. What is it, the Arab Spring? I think we need to understand that the notion, to begin with, the notion of Arab states is quite artificial. There was no, and there is no such a thing, Arab state. In the Middle East, there are families, tribes, ethnic groups. The notion of a state, the way we understand the state, is not there. Was never there. So when the British and the French actually withdrew from the Middle East, based on Sykes-Picot Agreement in the 40s, they left the Middle East. They were trying to create some kind of states. But those states, what are they? What were they? They were families with flag, with army, that were able, for some reasons, to terrorize their own people and to rule the territory in a very dramatic dictatorship kind of way. They were not states, there were not democracies and no systems of electing representatives, nothing like that. So for decades, I think, for 30, 40, or 50 years, those regimes, artificial regimes, which again were families with flags, were able to terrorize their people, but under the surface, the authentic forces of those territories in the Middle East continued to boil. And at some point, they got a critical mass of power, and like a volcano, they erupted from underneath, and they caused the collapse of those regimes. One after, like a domino effect. So we need to understand that what we are facing now in the Middle East is in many ways very authentic and natural situation in that area, which is, it's up to you to decide if it's frightening, if it's negative or positive, but we have to acknowledge and we have to realize it. If we want to go back to a situation where we're going to have in the future Arab states, I don't know. I mean, there are many things to discuss and to see if and how we can go about it. But in the near future, we're not going to see new Arab states. We're going to see different groups, different tribes, different organizations trying to fight over specific territories, or maybe over more than specific territories. And it's a new situation, but it's actually going back to the authentic nature and culture of that region. So those are the three main, I would say, developments that generated the situation where we are today. But I think there are four phenomena appearance, I would say, as a result of this situation of those developments, and we should also look at the appearance and realize and recognize and acknowledge them. First of all, the United States of America and its policy towards the Middle East is really changing while we're speaking. The US for many years, as you know, were very active kind of foreign policy. And of course there's also debate, always a debate here, whether The United States would like to be the sheriff of the world and be proactive about foreign policy in general and policy towards the Middle East in particular. Or maybe the American president and the American administration should focus more on domestic affairs and not, be so active or proactive about foreign policy. I think now it's very clear this administration has decided to pull back and to watch from behind and to be much more careful about sending troops and being actively involved in the Middle East. And again, I'm not criticizing, but the fact is that there are a few more regional or maybe even worldwide powers who take advantage. There is no vacuum. The Russians are there. The Russians are deep in Syria and deep in the Middle East again. And Iran is, of course, a result of one of the results of the nuclear agreement with the 5+1. Iran becomes again, slowly but surely, they become again a regional kind of superpower. So there's no vacuum. So if the United States decided to pull back and to watch from far and from behind, then it means that other forces are going to be active and going to have more significance or more impact in the region. And that's exactly what's happening. The other one, or the other apparent is that we're seeing is that it's true also about Europe, about the Western countries in Europe. France, England, Germany, they're not so enthusiastic about being involved in the Middle East. They also pull back. Yes, they make all kinds of statements and they have declarations, but they're not there. They're not active in the region. And the third apparent is that Europe as an entity, as a whole, is much less active in general and in particular in the Middle East. And the fourth one is that there is not even one serious international organization who is willing to really be involved actively in the Middle East. The UN would come up with many resolutions against Israel, unfortunately. We'll speak about it. But other than that, they won't do anything. So as a result of all these things, we are alone there. We, the people who live in the Middle East, the countries, the political entities in the Middle East, we are more or less alone. And this is also a very dramatic change that we need to get used to. We need to, in a minute I'll speak about the Israel strategy, or what I think Israel's policy should be. I think in that respect, again, we are facing very dramatic changes. So, within, I would say, this chaotic situation and all the developments and the appearances which I described here, new organizations become more and more powerful. ISIS is, of course, the most so-called famous organization. But ISIS is not the most powerful organization in the region. There are organizations that are well known, which we, the Israelis, really need to watch much more carefully than we watch ISIS. But let me speak a little bit about ISIS and about that phenomenon of terrorism that actually, it's a game changer. Why ISIS is a game changer? Because ISIS is the first terror organization that actually leverages the social media and the very advanced developments of the technology in order to recruit people on one hand, and in order to convey messages to the world on the other hand. And they are being very, very successful and very effective in that. It's a theater, I'm sorry to say. It's a theater more than anything. Dramatic stage, dramatic pictures, dramatic visuals. But it's basically they understand that if they want to achieve their political goals, they have to leverage and they have to use the most advanced technology that was developed in the West. So the knife, when they cut the throats of whoever, it's not a tool that they're using. Yes, it's of course, again, I'm sorry to say, excuse me for speaking like I'm not being a Machiavellist here, but I'm just looking at the situation and from a bird's eye view, and I'm telling you that what ISIS is doing is ISIS speaks the language of the West, not the language of the primitive in the Middle East. They speak the language of the social media users. They know how to convey messages and they know how to recruit young people by using the social media. So the terrorism that we see now in the region is what we call inspired or inspiring kind of terrorism. People are getting inspired by other people through those social media technologies. And in order to recruit someone, you don't have to pay him. All you have to do is you have to, create a, again, so-called cool situation where young people really want to belong to and to feel the excitement. And if you meet young people in places like France or England who were born there to families that immigrated 30, 40, 50 years ago from other countries, but never really integrated into the societies, then it's easy to get them. It's easy to recruit them. And that's exactly what ISIS do, what they do. Now, let's look for a few minutes on Israel and see what kind of policy, what kind of measures we can take if we live in that kind of dramatic changes or dramatic or chaotic situation. I think that the situation in the Middle East creates lots of threats, new threats, but also we have to acknowledge it and we have to leverage it. I think that the situation creates lots of opportunities as well. And the threats are clear, but let me say a few more about the threats and then I'll speak about the opportunities. The threats are clear. We don't face anymore the threats that we used to face when we were surrounded by organized militaries with thousands of tanks, thousands of combat planes, millions of soldiers. In 1973 Yom Kippur War, Egypt alone had more than 900,000 soldiers. So we were surrounded by millions of Arab soldiers, very, very structured and organized militaries. Then we faced strategic and sometimes even existential threats. We don't face those threats anymore. There are new threats. The new threats are new organizations like Hamas in the south and Hezbollah in the north. There are terror or guerrilla organizations. They act from centers of population. They count on it. They count on the international community that once they start firing rockets on Israel from centers of civilian population, that Israel will retaliate and then many civilians will get killed and wounded, and then the international community will jump as soon as possible and force Israel to stop. In that asymmetrical war, when Israel, of course, is much stronger, but it's much harder to fight, because, first of all, the threat is real. Hezbollah has more than 100,000 missiles and rockets pointed to Israel. So Israel is covered by missiles and rockets from the north and from the south. And as soon as they will start shooting, we will be very limited, again, in terms of the international community, morality, and all that. We will be very limited in our retaliation, in what we can do in order to fight. Now, if we really want to get rid of the leaderships, then we have to send troops and really get involved and get, back to Gaza and stay there and stuck there for months. I don't think it's the price that we should pay. So in many ways, the threats are different, but still very strategic to Israel. But again, I think that the new opportunities which we need to look at. And the opportunities are greater than the threats, the way I see it. Therefore, I'm optimistic. And let me tell you what the opportunities are. First of all, I think that for us, Israelis, the most important interest, the most important thing is to secure the majority of the Jewish people between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, meaning we have to separate from the Palestinians. I'm not looking for happy marriage, I'm looking for decent divorce, I would say. Has to be divorce, but it has to be decent also. I personally support two-state solution. I'm not sure that we have a partner. I don't think that, I'm not sure that the Palestinians are willing to sit back around the table and try to achieve that kind of solution. There is a trend now among the Palestinians and the Palestinian supporters in the world to go towards one-state solution, which actually means replace the Jewish state by a Muslim state. We'll speak about it later if you would like me to. But I think we have to separate from the Palestinians in order to secure Israel as a Jewish and a democratic state for the long term. For many years I've been involved in those negotiations. And they failed. Again, I don't want to start a blame game here. I was at least, in at least twice or three times in situations under different governments, different prime ministers, when the prime minister offered the Palestinian leader almost everything he wanted, including going back to the borders of '67, and the Palestinians said no. Sometimes it was the other way around. The Palestinian leaders wanted to sit and negotiate, and the Israeli leaders said no. I'm not going to that blame game. But obviously it failed. There's no agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Part of the reason, or maybe even the main part of the reason why it failed, the way I see it, is because the Arab and the Muslim world never really held the Palestinians as stakeholders or shareholders of this conflict. In other words, the Palestinians are perceived by some, victims and underdog. But if you ask King Abdullah of Jordan, who is authorized to speak with Israel about any kind of agreement in Jerusalem, he would say it belongs to the Jordanian Waqf, to us, to Jordan. There's no way that the Jordanian king or a Saudi king or the Arab League would authorize the Palestinians to speak with Israel about Jerusalem. The Palestinians are not perceived as the shareholders of the conflict. And so, what we have done for many years, we negotiated bilaterally, directly with the Palestinians, and we ignored that very important angle. And we never actually invited the real shareholders to sit around the table with us and try to get an agreement. We signed a peace treaty with Egypt back in 1979. And since then we said, okay, so now we have already a peace treaty with Egypt. The Egyptians are not, we don't want them to be involved anymore. Back in 1994, we signed a peace treaty with Jordan. And we said, okay, since then, the Jordanians, it's better for us to negotiate directly with the Palestinians. It's not going to work. There's no way to solve the problem with Gaza without the Egyptians being involved. And there's no way to solve, for the long term, the situation in the West Bank without the Jordanians being involved. In other words, we need to sit back around, a table with the key forces among the still pragmatic Arab world and try to achieve a regional agreement, and I think there is a chance for that. Not instead of the negotiations with the Palestinians, but along with the negotiations with the Palestinians. So if we thought for many years that we can get to the region through the Palestinians, I think that we have to go the other way around. Through the region, we can get to the Palestinians. And here's the most important question. How do we know that this is feasible? So two things I would say. First of all, The situation that I described at the beginning of my talk about what's going on in the Middle East creates a common ground for Israel and for the pragmatic forces within the Arab world, common ground and common interest to do exactly that. The Jordanian king is panicking because of ISIS and because of more than 2 million Syrian refugees who actually fled from Syria to Jordan. And the Egyptians really, it's very hard for them to face Hamas. Hamas is a threat not just to Israel, but also to Egypt. And the Saudis are so afraid of the Iranians, and they're anxious to cooperate with Israel. And to, on intelligence and on security and so on and so forth. And the states in the Gulf also are afraid of Hamas and ISIS and the most radical organizations, and they would like to join in some kind of a pragmatic coalition in the region. So now there is a window of opportunity to get to the Palestinian issue through the region. And that situation was created because of ISIS and because of the radical forces in Islam became more powerful. And because of the agreement between the 5+1 and Iran on the nuclear aspect. And the other thing is that about 12 or 13 years ago, when was it? 2002, 14 years ago, the Saudis submitted to the Arab League, it was on the 27th of March 2002, they submitted to the Arab League the Saudi Peace Initiative. And the Arab League adopted it, and it became Saudi Arab Peace Initiative. And look, as an Israeli, I don't accept the wording of that proposal. I would argue, I would bargain, I would negotiate, but I would accept it as a framework for negotiations. And since they were submitted to the Arab League, there was no Israeli leader, or there is no Israeli leader who actually responded to it. Now, when you listen to the Israeli leaders at the moment, they start to speak about the Arab-Saudi Peace Initiative because they understand that the regional approach is now becomes more and more feasible and more practical in a way. So I think we are facing great opportunities within that chaos. And I think that we can actually handle and cope with the threats that those terror organizations, including ISIS, force us to face. But for that, we need leaders on both sides. And I think that what the Israeli government does today is quite reasonable. What is it? What the Israeli government does today is, since the situation is so chaotic, the Prime Minister and the Cabinet say, we cannot decide at the moment whom to trust. We cannot decide at the moment who to go with for the long term because things are changing all the time. So what we need to do is to define, first of all, to ourselves, and then clarify to our neighbors what our red lines are. Red lines that nobody should cross. For example, let me give you an example. It's not a secret anymore, but sometimes strategic weapon moves from Syria to Lebanon, from the hands of the regime of Assad to organizations like Hezbollah and other very dangerous organizations in Lebanon. We cannot allow that to happen. So according to foreign media, whenever that happens, somebody does something about it. So it's a red line. We don't talk about the red lines, but we make it very clear, we clarify it in many ways to our neighbors what red lines they should not cross. That one thing. And the other thing is to take and to leverage the opportunity which I described about the region and to create a strategic, economic, intelligence and security cooperation between Israel and the pragmatic Arab forces, Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia and the states in the Gulf. Well, I have many more things to tell you, but maybe we'll open it for some questions and answers, and I'll be happy to answer the questions. Thank you.
Don't we have a microphone?
Dr. Hoffman would be willing to entertain questions from the audience.
It's like, and I can't put my finger on it, all over the world they're allowing this immigration to go on, and the leaders are just allowing it. Basically, I just wanted to understand why so much of what I'm afraid could be radical Islam is being allowed to immigrate all over the world, and the leaders of those countries don't seem to care or allowing it.
Well, it's a very good question. I think you raise a very complicated dilemma for any Western leader. Look, the world is sometimes playing a game which is at least double standards, right? So you look at all kinds of places in the world where conflicts really take place and sometimes escalate and bring to the death of millions of people. And everybody is hesitant. I mean, countries don't want to get involved. But at some point, somebody, some kind of organization or some kind of international group or international organization, somebody has to take responsibility. Somebody has to do something. Usually it's too late. And the thing is that there is a gap between the leaderships in those places and the millions of innocent people. Look at Gaza. Well, we can speak about Syria, but look at Gaza. About 2 million Palestinians, innocent Palestinians, are completely terrorized by 40,000 Hamas fighters. It's amazing, the proportion. You know, how 40,000 people can actually terrorize completely almost 2 million people. And so in Syria it's much more complicated because there are millions of innocent people, but about 17 different groups that fight over the territory and against each other, and the people are caught in between. And so, of course, so the world is looking at it, and somebody has to take some kind of responsibility or to do something about it. So Angela Merkel decided at some point that she's going to be very generous about immigrants, but soon enough she had to face reality and the problems that it creates in Germany, and now she's saying the opposite. She's saying, I'm sorry, but the refugees will have to stay in the Middle East. So I don't think the leaders, I think the leaders feel some kind of need to take responsibility, but when they really have to take that responsibility, I think they go back to square one, and they say, okay, first of all we are committed to our own people, and therefore I unfortunately don't think that the Western world will solve the problem of the refugees.
You mentioned the role of the United States in the region, first of all, but then also as a key ally to Israel. It seems to me that our primary means of diplomacy in recent years has been weapon systems and technology such as Iron Dome. Is that the best role for the United States, and how would you suggest that we expand our role in the Middle East or our relationship with Israel?
Let me tell you, if I was hired to be, even for a few hours, an advisor to an American president, I would say, look, we are missing something very important in the Middle East. We have all kinds of sticks being waved above our heads, especially in Israel, where we see groups and countries in Europe try to punish Israel with sanctions and with, it's not that frightening the way it sounds, but it's totally counterproductive. Because, and I'll get to the US in a second, because if those groups and those countries would like just to punish Israel, that's one thing. But if they would like to have any kind of impact on policy, it's not the most effective thing to do. The most effective thing to do, and here I think the United States has a major role, is to show the carrots, not just the sticks. Meaning, what would be the potential dividends and the potential benefits by changing the situation? There's no hope for people in the Middle East. There's no hope for those people, in Syria and even some some of the fighters in those organizations, all they hear about, all they know is the orders that they get from the commanders. If the world would come, led by the United States, to the Middle East, to the people, and would say, look, we can't force you to have an agreement, but this is going to be our contribution once we have an agreement. And I'm talking about financial, I'm talking about potential dividends. I would say that at least in some places in the Middle East, in those pragmatic places which I mentioned, Jordan and Egypt and Israel, of course, people would start to feel that if they will make an effort, if they will take the necessary risks in order to get together, negotiate, and have maybe some potential agreements, the world will be there, and there will be something tangible for them to look for. So I think I'm not suggesting that the United States will allocate budgets to the Palestinian economy, but I think that as a world leader, it could be a huge step, getting the other Western countries and international organizations, the World Bank, come to the people in the Middle East, to the governments, to the leaderships, and say, here, this is our contribution to a future agreement. Now people, put pressure on your leadership to go towards an agreement, because see what can you get out of it.
Yeah, it appears that any day, any month now, that there's a very real possibility that the Palestinian Authority will collapse. Abbas is old, weak politically. What do you think will happen if it does happen? Do they have a transition policy? Do you think Hamas will rush in to fill that vacuum? Will there be chaos? All of the above.
Well, all of the above can happen, of course, but if you ask me what I think, first of all, we should do as Israel, I think that we should initiate a peace plan. And I think that even though it's quite clear, at least to me, that Abbas is not going to be a partner for two-state solution anymore, unfortunately. I think that the next generation within the Palestinians, the next generation of the Palestinian leadership, should find Israelis who not just are willing to sit and talk, but initiating a plan. So I think Israel has nothing to lose by doing it. Actually, Israel can gain some points, from the international community. But that's the maximum we can do. We cannot interfere. We cannot really support any potential Palestinian leader among those who want to replace Abbas. So, it seems maybe strange, but let me tell you that there is a cooperation between Israel and the Palestinian Authority on security and other economic issues. It's not perfect, it's just partial cooperation. But I think that the Palestinians, or the next of the Palestinian leadership next generation of the Palestinian leadership, they know that. And I think that we will experience a serious fight within the Palestinian society between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority over the next leadership. But I think there is a good chance that Hamas will not come to power in the West Bank. I think that, unfortunately, Gaza is going to stay in the hands of Hamas, but I think the West Bank could, even after Abbas, see some reasonable, pragmatic, new Palestinian leaders, and hopefully they will be willing to sit with us and start talking about that two-state solution.
So I want to go back to Syria. So my question is, what does Russia really hope to gain by its continued support of Syria? What is it really trying to accomplish by being in the Middle East?
Russia has been waiting for many years to become again a superpower. And the economic situation and the political situation was very tough. So Putin is a very tough guy, but he never had a better opportunity than he has today to prove to the world that he becomes again a very significant force in the region. and maybe not just in the region, but by being involved directly and deeply in the region, that he becomes again a superpower worldwide. Especially in a period of time where, again, the American administration decides to go back, to more to domestic affairs rather than foreign policy and international affairs. So I think the Russian main interest is not really in the Middle East, is in the balance of power between Russia and the United States. And the Middle East is just a ball game, or just an angle of how to do it. And he, very sharp, very, hungry, and he's like a falcon, he saw an opportunity and he dived on it, and he's in Syria, he's willing to lose the lives of so-and-so Russian soldiers, but he's getting and gaining power, political power, and he's getting more and more countries in the world and in the region that will be, for the long term, under Russian influence and Russian impact. That's what he wants. He wants to play the game of the big guys, and he wants to bring back the Russian pride, the Russian dignity of being a superpower. And Syria is a very good opportunity for him to do it. He's willing to pay a price, a limited price for it, but that's exactly what he tries to achieve.
You mentioned in your talk the arrangement with the nuclear arrangement with Iran. I just wondered if you could share with us your feelings on that agreement.
I think it's a terrible agreement. Terrible agreement. And I tell you why. Because when you get an agreement, so strategic agreement with an entity which you can't really trust for the long term, then, and this is something that the Iranians are so desperate for, to be able to be freer about what they're doing and, get rid of the sanctions, economic sanctions and all that. Then there is a room for you, for the West, for the United States, for the 5+1, to put lots of conditions. And I would make a condition. I would say, first and foremost, listen, you Iran, we know what you're doing in the Middle East. You know how much damage you're doing by sending your proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, other terror organizations, to create or to contribute to that chaos that we see in the Middle East. You've got to stop it, and it has to be a condition. Now, the President of the United States, he's done exactly the opposite. He said, I'm talking with the Iranians about the nuclear plan, and I'm not going, and this is, it stands on its own 2 feet, and I'm not going to connect it to any other issue. I think it's a terrible mistake. Because maybe, I don't know, maybe, we'll see with the time, Iran will give up on its nuclear plan, which I doubt. But one thing is for sure, it becomes now much more powerful, much more influential than it was a few years ago. So we are maybe for 50-50 kind of chance getting something, but for 100% getting something much worse than that. Meaning Iran as a very fanatic, radical force in the Middle East, creating lots of problems to everybody's there and maybe to the world.
If you could comment, please, on the relationship between ethnicity and Islam in this context. The ethnic Kurds are predominantly Sunni Islam. The Arabs in the Islamic State are also predominantly Sunni. But I doubt very seriously whether there's an ethnic Kurd who would lose a night's sleep at all about the demise of any Arab Sunni that he fights. In this context, does ethnicity trump religion, or what is the relationship between the two?
I think that, I'll answer in a very general way. I think that the ethnic belongingness to different groups of people doesn't play such a significant role in the Middle East. Look, the regime in Syria, first of all, the Assad regime, Assad's family, they are Alawites. There have been only 12% of the Syrian population most of the Syrian population is Sunni. So, but the most influential Sunnis in Syria were actually helping the Alawites, the regime, in their terrorizing our own Sunni people. And the same thing applies to other regimes in the area. So I don't think that the different camps or organizations are divided by ethnic groups that much. Some are, but most of the times you will see coalitions between different ethnic groups, and the main thing is the political objectives. And here, let me tell you something very important. Sometimes when we hear about a new terror organization who seems to be more extreme than the others and totally irrational, let me assure you, each terror organization, even the most extreme ones, have very clear political goals. They know what they want to achieve. We say like ISIS is an organization without territory. It's not true. They really care for territories. They really care for oil fields. They really care for money. They really care for governance. They really care for people. That at some point they would like to become the most powerful political entity in the world. They are looking for political achievements. So in order to get political achievements, in order to achieve political goals, different ethnic groups get together in coalitions. So the question is interesting, but in terms of analyzing the results of the chaotic situation in the Middle East in the future, I don't think we could look at that. I think we could look at political interests and other interests rather than the belongingness in terms of ethnic groups.
When you talked about Sharia law, to me, it almost seems like a modern phenomenon. Did it really ever, was Sharia ever something? It always seemed like just tribal people. And I don't see how Sharia is a benefit. I mean, it's to the fallenness of whoever's ruling. And if you say something wrong, you get your head cut off. Just in history, was Sharia ever really a force of a governing, or is this more of a modern thing?
In Iran, it was for sure. Iran is a pure example where Sharia became the main tool of the leaders to keep the people very, very, very tight. And look, the young generation in Iran, we know it, are looking for normal lives. And for many, many years, the ayatollahs, the fanatic religious leaders in Iran, were able to keep millions of people by the law of Sharia and not letting them become, more liberal. So yes, the Sharia law, if you are strong enough to be able to force it and to implement it, is a very, very effective tool, unfortunately.
Yes, a question about ISIS. Do we know, is there a central organization, or is it completely a decentralized movement? Who's calling the shots?
ISIS is a very well-organized organization. It's not something fluid. It's not just people who get together by coincidence and then tomorrow they will kind of spread out and all that. It's very organized, very structured, and with the time it becomes more and more so. So, 20 years ago, or when was it, 9/11 in 2001, 15 years ago, most of the people for the first time heard about Al-Qaeda. And at that time, with the horrific effects and results of what Al-Qaeda did here in the States, people tend to think that at that time that Al-Qaeda is again something like ghosts. Nobody knows who they are, where they come from. And then it took time, but then people realized that Al-Qaeda is a very, very well-organized organization and very well structured. Same thing with ISIS today. And with the time, again, they will have more political objectives. If they will not be defeated, hopefully they will get defeated at some point. But if not, they will become, they'll have a very clear hierarchy of leadership, and it will be very clear who behind them and who are they. And I don't think the intelligence will have such a terrible time to track and to try to gather information. By the way, let me tell you something about, sometimes, we think about the chaotic situation in the Middle East and we think about the cutting-edge intelligence that Israel and the United States have and how difficult, what kind of races between the intelligence people and to really understand what's going on and how to gather the very precise information. and in intelligence you have two levels. One level is to really gather information, which is difficult enough, but it's possible. And the other level is sometimes extremely difficult, and this is how you assess the information and what kind of forecast you can come with according or based on the information you gather. Unfortunately, I cannot share what's going on behind closed doors, but let me tell you a little story that illustrates exactly the challenge of intelligence of today. There's a story about a little village in Montana of American natives that they had a chief who could look at the sky at the end of the summer and tell the people how much wood to collect in order to prepare for the winter. And every summer, the people would come and he would tell them, and one day he passed away. And his grandchild took over. And the people, tradition is a tradition and habit is a habit, so people would come to the new chief and said, Chief, how much wood do we need to prepare for the winter? Now this guy was, he grew up in a modern life, didn't know anything about the nature. So just to be on the safe side, he said the winter is going to be quite cold, go and collect wood. They went and he wanted to be really sure about himself, so he called the weather station, weatherman. Asked them how cold the winter is going to be, and they said the winter is going to be quite cold. So he felt okay. 2 weeks later, the people came again and said, Chief, we collected so much wood. Are you sure the winter is going to be so freezing? He wanted to be on the safe side. He said, look, it's going to be so freezing, I can't remember that kind of cold winter in the last 20, 30 years. They left, he wanted to make sure, called the weatherman, and the weatherman tells him, it's going to be so cold, I can't remember the so-called winter 20 years ago. So he said to the weatherman, how do you know? He said, what do you mean? Did you see how much wood the Indians are collecting? Think about intelligence, guys. Think about it. Who is your reliable source? You watch someone's behavior and what you assess what they're doing, but they look at you and they assess what you're doing, and it's a vicious cycle and nobody knows what's going on. And this is a challenge. How much wood to prepare for the cold winter of the Arab Spring?
How do you see the current Syrian peace process unfolding? How optimistic are you, and what end game?
Syrian peace process?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't believe that there is goodwill over there. I think there are interests of survival. I think that President Assad of Syria wants to stay in power, and for staying in power, he's willing to divide Syria to two parts. I think that the other organizations are still fighting among themselves, and as long as they will not come to terms with the agreement of who is going to take the leadership, I'm talking about the opposition, it will not be possible. So two conditions actually are needed in order to create some kind of stability in Syria. And it's possible, but two conditions are. One is that the world will force Assad to divide Syria, but would promise him that he would be able to stay in power in part of Syria close to the coast. And the other thing is that the world would put pressure on the opposition, on those 15 different organizations, try to get an agreement among themselves who's going or how they're going to take over the rest of the land in Syria. It's possible, it's very difficult, but I don't think it will come out of goodwill.
We have a question over here, Jerry.
Well,
Yes. Frequently, the Western press gets it wrong. They filter things, and sometimes we just don't get the true story. What is your feelings or what is your thinking that if the two-state Israel were to exist, what might be some of the negatives of that?
Of
A two-state solution.
two-state solution, the negative?
Yes. What went into your thinking, may I ask?
The negative side about reaching a solution of two states is, of course, the need to compromise. Now, it depends how you look at it. Sometimes, there are situations that you don't need to compromise, and then you get everything for yourself, and then you can think that this is positive. When you think about compromise, you tend to think that this is negative. That's not the way I see it. I'm looking at the cost benefit, and I tend to assume that in very few situations in life, you can actually get everything you want. And most of the times you have to make your own priorities and decide what kind of price you're willing to pay in order to get what is the most important for you. For us, the Israelis, the most important is to secure the two fundamental values of Israel, which is being a Jewish state and being a democratic state. And for that we have to make sure that the majority between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River are Jews. And I think we have the right to protect those values, not just the duty. In other words, compromise for me is a price, because in my dreams, I would like to, see other neighbors. I would like to see more land. I would like to see the Jordan River in the middle of the state of Israel. But it's just a dream. And I think that if we want to be realistic, we need to compromise. And in that respect, we need to look at the compromise as a positive element, not as a negative element. And by the way, the same applies to the Palestinians. For them to compromise with us could be a negative or positive, depends, it's on the eye of the beholder. So it's up for interpretation, and I think that that negative element of compromise is actually positive.
We have time for one more question.
I'm thinking of a talk that was given by Václav Havel some years back at the time of the transition between the Czechs and the Russians. And he said something like, what the Czechs want is food, and they want jobs, and they want housing, and they want to be safe. They like freedom. But what they really need is hope. So how do we get hope out of all of this? How do we get it? Who provides it? Where does it come from?
It's a very, very, I think, good question to sum up with, to end up. I think in order to be able to feel a real hope, you need inspiring leaders and leaderships. Because the duty of a leader is not just to keep you alive. It's important, very important. But I think that the duty of the leader is to provide hope to his own people. Now, when I think about conflicts in general, and even very extreme kind of conflicts like we see in the Middle East, I tend to remember, or I force myself to remember, that it's all about people. If you get a critical mass of people in the crowd, and critical mass of leaders who would like to resolve any kind of conflict, so any kind of conflict is resolvable. And we need to make sure that we have, or we choose, or we elect the leaders who can come up with a hope and look at people's eyes and say, people, it's about us, it's about people. Now, we're always going to have people who will not be listening and who will look for, the negative. Fine. All we need to have is critical mass of people who would support stability, agreements, and to create that, we need leaderships on, I would say, several sides. And I think that we're not that far from it. I think that the negative chaos that we see at the moment is actually is an accelerator for leaders to be able to look at the opportunities and to catch the train before the other pragmatic regimes in the area are going to collapse. In order to make sure that the regimes like Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia are going to stay in power, you have to provide some kind of hope to the people. And I'm optimistic. I think that we're going to see that hope, and we're going to hopefully see better times very soon. Thank you very much for coming.
Three quick things as we leave. One, we have plenty of food on the side, so please do partake. Secondly, if you're interested in any of the future events and talks, I'll leave your email in the back. And thirdly, let's thank our speaker tonight for wonderful.